As moonlight briefly pierced the howling blizzard, Sarah Miller spotted a man collapse at the edge of their driveway, his dark silhouette crumpling against the blinding white snow. By sunrise, her century-old farmhouse would be surrounded by black SUVs and stern-faced agents with earpieces, transforming their quiet corner of Oakridge Valley into the center of a national security operation. All because a farmer's wife chose kindness over caution on the coldest night in decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bitter February wind rattled the farmhouse windows as Sarah Miller moved methodically through her evening routine, checking that the livestock were secure in the barn before the blizzard intensified. At 43, her face carried the gentle weathering of someone who had spent a lifetime working outdoors. Laugh lines framing eyes that missed little and hands that remained strong despite the arthritis beginning to settle in her joints. Her chestnut hair, threaded with early silver, was pulled back in a practical braid that reached halfway down her back. "Thomas, did you bring in more firewood?" she called toward the basement, where her husband was checking on their generator. With winter storms becoming increasingly unpredictable in Hawthorne County, they had invested in the backup system 3 seasons ago, a decision that had already proven its worth several times over. 3 days' worth, stacked by the hearth, came the reply as Thomas climbed the stairs, wiping his hands on a rag. At 45, he stood tall despite the slight curve in his spine from decades of farm work. His beard, once as dark as freshly tilled soil, now carried more salt than pepper, but his eyes remained bright with the resilience required of those who made their living from the land. Generators fueled up. "We should be fine, even if power's out for a couple days." Sarah nodded, moving to the kitchen window to survey the farm that had been in Thomas's family for 4 generations. Willow Creek Farm wasn't large by modern standards, just over 100 acres of mixed cultivation and pasture. But it had supported the Miller family through depressions, droughts, and changing agricultural trends. The farmhouse itself, built in 1920 by Thomas's great-grandfather, stood as a testament to enduring craftsmanship with its solid oak beams and thick stone foundation. In recent years, maintaining the farm's viability had become increasingly challenging. Large agricultural corporations had been systematically buying up neighboring properties, offering aging farmers sums that seemed generous until one calculated the true value of land that had nourished families for generations. The Hawthorne Agricultural Development Corporation, locally known simply as HAD Corp, had already acquired 17 farms in the valley, transforming diverse family operations into uniform industrial-scale production. Thomas came up behind Sarah, wrapping his arms around her waist as they both watched the snow begin to fall more heavily, erasing the boundaries between fields and sky. "Weather Service says this could be the worst blizzard in 30 years, he murmured, glad Rachel decided to stay at the dorm instead of trying to drive home this weekend. Their daughter, studying agricultural science at the state university 70 miles away, had called earlier to let them know she was remaining on campus until the roads cleared. At 19, Rachel represented both their greatest pride and deepest concern. Would the farm still be viable when she completed her education? Would there be anything left to inherit if HAD Corp continued its aggressive expansion? The lights flickered once, twice, and then stabilized as the wind intensified outside. Sarah moved to the vintage radio on the kitchen counter. Cell service was always the first to go during severe weather in the valley, and their satellite internet connection wasn't much more reliable. The weather report crackled through with increasing static, expectations of 20 to 30 inches of accumulation, with wind gusts exceeding 50 miles per hour. Residents are advised to shelter in place and avoid all unnecessary travel. power outages are likely throughout the region. Thomas adjusted the antenna, trying to improve the faltering reception. Think we should check on the Collinses? Henry mentioned his generator wasn't running right last time I saw him at Parker's store. Sarah considered this, mentally calculating the risk. The neighboring farm was only a half-mile down the road, but in blizzard conditions, even short distances became treacherous. Let's try calling their landline first. If we can't get through, maybe you could take the tractor over in the morning when there's daylight. As Thomas reached for the phone, the lights gave one final valiant flicker before surrendering to the storm's fury, plunging the farmhouse into darkness except for the warm glow emanating from the wood stove in the living room. Sarah moved with practiced ease, lighting the oil lamps they kept ready for such occasions while Thomas checked the generator. The mechanical growl of the backup power system soon hummed to life, providing enough electricity for essential needs, the furnace, refrigerator, and a few critical outlets. With the immediate concerns addressed, Sarah turned her attention to dinner, a pot of venison stew made from a deer Thomas had harvested in the fall, simmered on the wood stove, filling the house with comforting aromas of rosemary and thyme from their garden. The bread she'd baked that morning waited on the cutting board, its crust heartier than store-bought varieties, but infinitely more satisfying. As they sat down to eat by lamplight, the familiar routine offered a sense of security against the howling chaos outside. They had weathered storms before, both literal and metaphorical. When drought had withered their crops 3 summers ago, they had diversified into specialty organic produce that commanded premium prices at farmers' markets in Riverdale. When the bank had questioned renewing their operating loan last spring, they had presented a business plan that incorporated agritourism opportunities. The Millers were nothing if not adaptable. Had Corp representatives stopped by yesterday while you were delivering to the Riverdale market, Thomas mentioned between bites, his expression carefully neutral, offered 20% more than they did last summer. Sarah set down her spoon, her appetite momentarily forgotten, and I told him what I told him before, Willow Creek Farm isn't for sale. The firmness in Thomas's voice was underscored by the subtle clench of his jaw. Though he made a point of mentioning the Petersons and the Garcias both signed contracts last week, Sarah absorbed this news with a measured breath. The Petersons had farmed the valley for nearly as long as the Millers. The Garcias had arrived in the 1970s, but had quickly become integral to the community. Their departure would leave Willow Creek Farm increasingly isolated among Haiti Corp's industrial operations. "We'll figure it out," she said finally, reaching across the table to squeeze her husband's weathered hand. "We always do." The meal concluded with companionable silence, broken only by the persistent howl of wind finding new crevices to explore in the old farmhouse's structure. Thomas stoked the fire while Sarah cleared the table, both moving through the familiar choreography of a winter evening without power. The transistor radio now reported road closures throughout Hawthorne County and emergency shelters opening in Riverdale for stranded travelers. "Going to check the barn one more time," Thomas announced, pulling on his heavy insulated coveralls and Arctic-rated boots. "Make sure everything's battened down proper." Sarah nodded, knowing better than to suggest he wait until morning. Thomas's obsession with ensuring the animals' comfort during extreme weather was one of the many reasons she had fallen in love with him 25 years earlier. "Take the two-way radio," she reminded him. Their set had proven more reliable than cell phones during previous outages. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. While Thomas braved the elements, Sarah prepared the house for a potentially extended period of isolation. She filled additional containers with water, checked their emergency medical supplies, and took inventory of the pantry. The shelves were well stocked with home-canned vegetables and preserves from their summer garden, supplemented by bulk staples they always maintained through winter. The distinctive signal of the two-way radio interrupted her preparations. "Sarah, you there?" Thomas's voice competed with the static and wind noise. "Here, everything okay at the barn? Animals are fine, but the west side door is straining against the wind. I'm going to reinforce it before it gives way. Might be a while. Be careful." Sarah fought to keep the concern from her voice. Thomas knew what he was doing, but blizzard conditions had a way of making even routine tasks dangerous. With her husband occupied, Sarah turned to the paperwork that inevitably accumulated during farming operations. At the kitchen table now, illuminated by the warm glow of an oil lamp, she reviewed seed catalogs for spring planting, compared feed prices from different suppliers, and updated their meticulous financial records. The spreadsheets revealed the precarious balance they maintained, not poor by any means, but vulnerable to the unexpected expenses that farming regularly produced. The sudden, sharp report of breaking glass jerked Sarah from her calculations. She froze, listening intently over the storm's persistent howl. Another crash followed, this one accompanied by a heavy thud that vibrated through the floorboards. Instinctively, she reached for the shotgun they kept secured in the cabinet near the back door, her heart pounding as she released the safety. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. No answer came. Moving cautiously toward the mudroom where the sounds had originated, Sarah kept the shotgun lowered but ready. The beam of her flashlight revealed shards of glass scattered across the floor from a small window in the door, and slumped beneath it, a man's body partially covered in rapidly melting snow. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. The warnings about strangers that had been drilled into her since childhood, warring with the humanitarian instincts that rural life had equally instilled. The man wasn't moving, and blood stained the snow around him a garish crimson. Decision made, she secured the shotgun and cautiously approached. "Hello? Can you hear me?" The stranger groaned, shifting slightly. Close up, Sarah could see he was well dressed beneath his inadequate overcoat, expensive shoes now ruined by snow, tailored pants, a tie still knotted despite his condition. His face, where not obscured by blood from a gash across his forehead, appeared remarkably young, mid-30s, perhaps, with features that suggested someone unaccustomed to physical hardship. "I'm going to help you," Sarah said firmly, though she wasn't certain he could hear her. "But I need to know you're not a threat to my family." The man's eyes fluttered open, revealing a disoriented gaze that gradually focused on her face. "Car. Went off. Road," he managed, each word clearly requiring immense effort. "Walking. Saw lights." Sarah made her decision. Using strength developed through decades of farm work, she helped the semi-conscious stranger to his feet and guided him toward the living room couch. He leaned heavily against her, his expensive leather shoes sliding on the hardwood floors as they made their slow progress from the mudroom. "My husband will be back soon," she informed him as she settled him onto the couch. Both reassurance and warning. "Let's get you warmed up and look at that cut on your head." The stranger nodded weakly, his complexion alarmingly pale except for the crimson gash across his forehead. Up close, Sarah noticed other details. His manicured hands, the sleek watch partially concealed by his coat sleeve, the subtle scent of cologne not quite masked by the metallic tang of blood, and the crisp smell of snow. Whoever he was, he didn't belong in rural Hawthorne County. She retrieved their extensive first aid kit, a necessity when the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away in good weather, and set about cleaning the head wound. The process seemed to revive the stranger somewhat, his eyes becoming more alert as she worked. "Thank you," he said, his voice stronger now. "I didn't think anyone would find me out there." "You're lucky you made it to our farm," Sarah replied, applying antiseptic to the cut with practiced efficiency. Nothing but fields and forest for miles around, and in this weather. She let the implication hang in the air between them. "James," he offered suddenly. "James Bennett. Sarah." "Miller, this is Willow Creek Farm." She finished securing a bandage to his forehead. "Now, Mr. Bennett, if you don't mind my asking, what brings a man in Italian leather shoes to a back road in Hawthorne County during the worst blizzard in 3 decades? James Bennett's expression tightened, something unreadable flickering across his features before he composed himself. "I was heading to a meeting in Riverdale when navigation suggested a shortcut. By the time I realized it was taking me through remote areas, the storm had worsened and—" He gestured vaguely. "My car slid off the road about a mile back. No cell service, of course." The explanation was plausible enough, yet something about it felt rehearsed to Sarah's ears. 23 years of watching Thomas attempt to hide birthday surprises had made her sensitive to the subtle cadences of partial truths. "You're not dressed for winter in Hawthorne County," she observed, nodding toward his city-appropriate but blizzard-inadequate attire. A small, self-deprecating smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I've been told I overdress for most occasions. It's an occupational hazard. And what occupation would that be?" Before he could answer, the back door burst open with a swirl of snow and frigid air as Thomas returned, stomping his boots on the mat to dislodge accumulated snow. He stopped short at the sight of the stranger on their couch, his expression immediately shifting to protective wariness. "Thomas," Sarah said calmly, "this is James Bennett. His car went off the road about a mile from here. Mr. Bennett, my husband, Thomas Miller." Thomas's assessing gaze took in the stranger's clothing, the bandage on his forehead, and the obvious incongruity of his presence in their home. With the deliberate movements of someone buying time to think, he removed his outer layers before approaching. "Lucky you found our place," he said finally, extending a calloused hand. "Not much out this way except Willow Creek Farm." James accepted the handshake with what appeared to be genuine gratitude. "Your wife likely saved my life. I don't think I would have lasted much longer out there." Something passed between the two men in that handshake, an unspoken male communication that Sarah had observed countless times at farm auctions and community meetings. Thomas's posture relaxed fractionally, though the caution never quite left his eyes. "Storm's getting worse," he reported, moving to warm his hands by the wood stove. "Had to secure the livestock in the inner stalls. Wind tore part of the west. Side roofing off the equipment shed." Sarah absorbed this information with the pragmatism of a woman accustomed to agricultural setbacks. "We'll assess the damage in daylight. For now, I think our guest could use some hot food and dry clothes." "Bitty." While Thomas showed James to the downstairs bathroom where he could change into borrowed clothes, Sarah reheated venison stew and sliced more bread. Her mind worked through the practicalities. The guest room hadn't been used since Rachel left for college, but the sheets were clean and there were extra blankets in the cedar chest. With the roads impassable, their unexpected visitor would need to stay at least until morning. When the men returned, James looked markedly different in Thomas's flannel shirt and jeans, both slightly too large for his leaner frame. The incongruity of his expensive watch and signet ring against the worn fabric created an almost comical effect, though Sarah noted he carried himself with the same innate confidence regardless of attire. The meal progressed with the careful conversation of strangers finding common ground. James proved surprisingly knowledgeable about agricultural policy, asking informed questions about the challenges facing small farms in the region. Thomas, initially reticent, gradually engaged as the discussion touched on water rights and corporate consolidation. "So this had Corp," James said, reaching for a second helping of stew. "They've been systematically acquiring farms throughout the valley." Thomas nodded, his expression darkening. Started about 5 years ago. They come in offering what seems like good money to retiring farmers with no succession plans. Once they established a foothold, they began pressuring the rest of us, buying water rights, challenging property boundaries, nudging county commissioners to change zoning regulations. It's not just about the money, Sarah added, refilling James's water glass. These farms represent generations of knowledge and connection to the land. When HAD Corp takes over, they implement standardized industrial practices that might maximize short-term yields but degrade soil health over time. James listened with unexpected intensity, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed a sophisticated understanding of agricultural economics. And your farm, Willow Creek, it's been in the family for generations. 4, Thomas confirmed. My great-grandfather built this house in 1920, but the Millers have worked this land since 1894. We're hoping our daughter Rachel will be the 5th generation, if circumstances allow. A comfortable silence settled over the kitchen, punctuated only by the persistent howl of wind and the occasional creak of the old farmhouse adjusting to the temperature changes. Sarah studied their guest as he finished his meal, still unable to reconcile his polished demeanor with his presence on a remote country road during a blizzard. You never did say what you do for a living, Mr. Bennett, she observed, collecting the empty bowls. James, please, he corrected with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I work in policy analysis, primarily agricultural and rural development issues. For the state? Thomas asked. Federal level, James replied, his tone deliberately casual. More of an advisory capacity these days. Before either Miller could press further, the two-way radio on the counter crackled to life. Miller Farm, this is Officer Thompson. Anyone reading me? Over. Thomas retrieved the radio. Jake, this is Thomas. We're reading you. Over. Just checking in on residents along Old Mill Road, came the staticky reply, making sure everyone's accounted for during the storm. You folks doing all right out there? Over. We're fine, Jake. Power's out, but the generator's running. We've also got a stranded motorist staying with us, James Bennett. His car went off the road about a mile east of our place. Over. A lengthy pause followed before Officer Thompson's voice returned, the casual tone now notably absent. Could you spell that name for me? Over. Thomas glanced questioningly at James, who had gone very still. Bennett, B-E-N-N-E-T-T, first name James. Over. Another pause, longer this time. Copy that. Sit tight, Thomas. Don't go anywhere. We'll check on you when the roads are passable. Over and out. The abrupt end to the conversation hung in the air as Thomas returned the radio to its charging station. Jake Thompson's been our local officer for 15 years, he explained to James. Never known him to be so formal. James nodded, his expression carefully neutral as he helped clear the table. Small towns. Everyone knows everyone. Which is why strangers tend to stand out, Sarah added pointedly. Their guest smiled, a genuine expression this time that transformed his face from merely handsome to charismatic. Fair point, Mrs. Miller. I imagine I'm the most interesting thing to happen in Oakridge Valley in quite some time. Oh, I wouldn't say that, Thomas replied with unexpected dryness. Last spring, Henry Collins's prize bull broke through 3 fences and ended up in the middle of the high school baseball championship. Created quite the sensation. The tension in the room dissipated as James laughed, the sound surprisingly unguarded. The evening progressed with Thomas retrieving a well-worn chessboard, and to Sarah's mild surprise, their guest proved a formidable opponent, eventually forcing Thomas into a rare checkmate. As the old grandfather clock in the hallway chimed, 11, Sarah prepared the guest room, leaving fresh towels and a battery-powered lantern on the nightstand. When she returned to the living room, she found the men engaged in a discussion about water conservation techniques that had drawn Thomas to the bookshelf, where he was pulling out agricultural journals to reference specific studies. "I've made up the guest room," she announced. "Mr. Bennett, James, you must be exhausted after your ordeal." James nodded gratefully, rising from his chair with a slight wince that suggested his body was beginning to register the full impact of his misadventure in the snow. "I can't thank you both enough for your hospitality. Not everyone would take in a stranger on a night like this." "Folks help each other in farm country," Thomas replied simply. "It's how we survive." After their guest retired, Sarah and Thomas completed their nightly routine in the comfortable silence of a long married couple. It wasn't until they were in their bedroom, door closed against the possibility of being overheard, that Thomas voiced what they'd both been thinking. "He's not just some government worker who took a wrong turn." Sarah nodded, unpinning her long braid. "No, there's something he's not telling us." Jake's reaction to his name was strange too. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, removing his work-worn boots, almost like he recognized it. "Well, whoever he is, he's not going anywhere tonight," Sarah reasoned pragmatically. "And he doesn't seem dangerous, just out of place." Thomas agreed with a tired nod. "We'll figure it out. In the morning. Roads should be clear enough by then for him to arrange whatever help he needs to retrieve his car." They settled into bed, the familiar creaks of the old farmhouse and the persistent howl of the blizzard creating the winter soundtrack they'd known all their lives. Despite the storm's ferocity, Sarah found herself drifting towards sleep, her body surrendering to the day's accumulated fatigue. The dream came first as a distant wail, different from the wind, more mechanical and rhythmic. In her semi-conscious state, Sarah incorporated it into fragmented images of spring planting and summer harvests. It wasn't until Thomas shook her gently awake that she realized the sound existed outside her dreams. "Sarah, wake up." His voice carried an unfamiliar edge. "Something's happening." She blinked into the pre-dawn darkness, momentarily disoriented. "What time is it?" "Just after 5. Listen." Now fully awake, Sarah recognized the sound that had penetrated her dreams, the distinctive whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of helicopter rotors seemingly directly overhead. "News chopper for the storm coverage," she suggested, though she didn't believe it herself. Thomas was already pulling on his clothes. Awfully low for news coverage. And there's something else. Vehicle engines. Lots of them. Sarah joined him at the bedroom window, which faced the long driveway connecting Willow Creek Farm to Old Mill Road. In the faint grey light of approaching dawn, she could make out the silhouettes of at least 4 large vehicles parked at the junction of their drive and the county road, their headlights illuminating the continuing snowfall. As they watched, dark figures moved with military precision through the pre-dawn dimness, establishing positions around the perimeter of their property. "Wake our guest," Thomas said grimly, reaching for the shotgun they kept secured in their bedroom closet. "I think he has some explaining to do." Sarah moved quietly to the guest room and found it empty, the bed neatly made as if it had never been slept in. A quick search of the main floor revealed no sign of James Bennett. It wasn't until she glanced out the front window that she spotted him standing on their porch despite the bitter cold, silhouetted against the swirling snow as he spoke into what appeared to be a satellite phone. She opened the front door, allowing a gust of frigid air to announce her presence. "Mr. Bennett, would you care to explain why our farm is suddenly surrounded by what looks like a government tactical team at dawn?" James turned, his expression apologetic, but no longer carrying the vulnerability of the stranded traveler they'd rescued. His posture had transformed overnight, shoulders squared, chin lifted, the subtle aura of authority that can't be faked radiating from his stance. Mrs. Miller, he began, his voice carrying the weight of official capacity, I owe you and your husband an explanation and an apology. My name is indeed James Bennett, but what I didn't share is that I'm the Deputy Director of Rural Affairs for the White House. Sarah stared at him, processing this revelation, as Thomas joined them on the porch, shotgun held cautiously at his side. The helicopter's landing in our east field, he reported tensely. Someone better start talking fast. James, or Deputy Director Bennett, as his true identity now revealed, nodded gravely. The President of the United States is on that helicopter, Mr. Miller, and he's here specifically to see your farm. The declaration hung in the frigid air between them, seeming almost as improbable as the blizzard suddenly transforming into a summer breeze. Thomas's grip on the shotgun tightened imperceptibly. That's not funny, he said finally, his voice low with controlled anger. I don't know what game you're playing, but it's not a game, James interrupted, his tone carrying the practiced calm of someone accustomed to delivering extraordinary news. President Harrington has spent the past 6 months evaluating sites for a new rural American preservation initiative. Your farm, along with 12 others across the country, has been shortlisted as a potential centerpiece for the program. Sarah's mind raced, trying to make sense of this surreal development. You're saying the President of the United States is landing in our east pasture without warning during a blizzard? Before James could respond, a new voice joined the conversation, crisp, authoritative, and unmistakably familiar from countless press conferences and national addresses. Not entirely without warning, Mrs. Miller, though I apologize for the dramatic entrance. They turned to find a woman in her early 60s approaching through the snow, flanked by 2 men whose alert postures and subtle earpieces identified them as Secret Service agents. Despite the early hour and harsh conditions, President Eleanor Harrington appeared immaculately composed in a practical yet elegant winter coat, her silver hair catching the first rays of dawn breaking through the storm clouds. Madame President, James acknowledged with a respectful nod. The Millers were just expressing some understandable confusion about our arrival. I imagine so, President Harrington replied, her gaze focusing on Thomas and the shotgun still held at his side. Mr. Miller, I assure you that weapon won't be necessary, though I appreciate your protective instincts toward your home and wife. Thomas slowly lowered the shotgun, his expression a mixture of shock and suspicion. With all due respect, Madame President, I'd appreciate knowing why the leader of the free world is standing on my porch at dawn after one of the worst blizzards in county history. President Harrington's smile revealed the political savvy that had carried her through 2 terms in office. Straightforward question deserves a straightforward answer. I'm here because what's happening to American family farms represents a national security crisis, and your Willow Creek farm may help us address it. Sarah found her voice, years of dealing with agricultural bureaucrats, overcoming her initial shock. You could have called first. A genuine laugh escaped the president. Mrs. Miller, in my experience, announced visits yield carefully orchestrated presentations. I needed to see the real Willow Creek farm, not a polished version prepared for a presidential inspection. She gestured toward the house. Now, if you'll permit me, I'd appreciate continuing this conversation somewhere warmer. Dawn in February isn't ideal for outdoor meetings, even for matters of national importance. The surreal procession moved into the farmhouse kitchen. The President of the United States, her deputy director, 2 Secret Service agents who positioned themselves discreetly by the doors, and the still stunned Millers. Sarah moved automatically to stoke the wood stove and put on coffee, her farmer's hospitality overriding the extraordinary circumstances. As the kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of fresh coffee, the initial shock began to fade, replaced by practical questions. Madame President, Thomas began, settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table, I still don't understand why our farm warrants this level of attention. President Harrington accepted the mug Sarah offered with a grateful nod. Excellent. Coffee, Mrs. Miller. To answer your question, Mr. Miller, your farm represents something increasingly rare in America, a multi-generational family operation that has successfully adapted to changing agricultural conditions while maintaining its independence from corporate conglomerates. We've been lucky, Thomas said cautiously. Luck had little to do with it, James interjected, retrieving a tablet from his briefcase. Your farm's productivity per acre exceeds regional averages by 17%. Your water management techniques have allowed you to maintain yields during drought conditions that devastated neighboring operations. Your soil health metrics are exceptional, and your carbon sequestration levels suggest sustainable practices dating back decades. Sarah exchanged a surprised glance with her husband. You've been studying our farm. We've been studying successful family farming operations nationwide, President Harrington clarified. The data is readily available through USDA programs, satellite imagery, and county agricultural extensions. But what you can't quantify through those reports, James added, is the human element, the knowledge passed down through generations, the daily decisions that balance immediate needs against long-term sustainability, the connection to community that corporations can't replicate. Thomas studied the presidential party with growing understanding. This isn't just about Willow Creek Farm. No, President Harrington confirmed, her expression turning serious. It's about the systematic dismantling of America's agricultural heritage and the national security implications of allowing corporations to control our food production systems. The kitchen fell silent, except for the crackling of the wood stove and the persistent howl of the diminishing storm outside. Sarah poured more coffee, her practical nature seeking concrete details amid the lofty rhetoric. You mentioned a rural American preservation initiative, she prompted. What exactly does that entail? President Harrington nodded appreciatively at the direct question. In simple terms, a comprehensive program to ensure the viability of family farms through improved access to capital, technology, and markets, combined with regulatory protections against predatory corporate acquisition tactics. Politicians have been promising to save family farms for generations, Thomas observed skeptically. Meanwhile, operations like Hadcorp continue swallowing independent farms with no meaningful opposition. Which is precisely why we're approaching this differently, James explained, retrieving documents from his briefcase. Instead of generalized programs, we're identifying specific regional agricultural ecosystems where preserving family farm operations is both economically viable and strategically essential. Oakridge Valley is one such ecosystem, the president continued. The water resources, soil composition, and established agricultural infrastructure here represent a national asset that shouldn't be homogenized into industrial monoculture. Sarah's practical mind immediately focused on specifics. And how exactly would this initiative affect our farm and our neighbors? James slid the document folder across the table. The program would establish agricultural preservation zones, where corporate acquisition of farmland would face enhanced scrutiny and regulatory hurdles. Family farms within these zones would receive preferential access to USDA programs, infrastructure investments, and technological partnerships. In exchange for what? Thomas asked, the wariness of a farmer who had seen too many well-intentioned government programs go awry evident in his tone. Continued adherence to sustainable agricultural practices, participation in regional knowledge-sharing networks, and a commitment to maintaining family ownership for at least 20 years, James replied. The goal isn't to freeze farms in time, but to ensure they evolve under the stewardship of families rather than corporate boardrooms. President Harrington leaned forward, her expression revealing the passionate conviction that had surprised political observers throughout her career. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller, let me be candid. In my remaining months in office, I intend to establish a framework that will outlast my presidency and provide meaningful protection for America's agricultural heritage. But for this initiative to succeed, it needs authentic family farms as its foundation, not carefully selected showpieces, but working operations facing real challenges." "Like Had Corp breathing down our necks," Thomas said quietly. "Precisely," the president nodded. "We need Willow Creek Farm and others like it to serve as proving grounds for policies that can be implemented nationwide." Sarah, who had been quietly examining the documents while the conversation continued, looked up with the shrewd assessment of someone who had reviewed countless contracts and proposals over the years. These protections against corporate acquisition, they would apply immediately. "They would," James confirmed. "The initial executive order establishing the framework is already drafted. What we need now is a thorough understanding of on-the-ground conditions to refine the implementation details." Thomas's expression remained guarded. "And our neighbors who've already sold to Had Corp. The initiative includes provisions for family farms to repurchase previously sold land under favorable terms if they choose," President Harrington explained. "Though we can't force Had Corp to sell, we can create economic and regulatory incentives that make it advantageous for them to do so." The conversation continued as dawn fully broke over Willow Creek Farm, illuminating the kitchen with the golden light of a winter morning after storm. Outside, the Secret Service perimeter maintained a respectful distance, while additional staff from the presidential motorcade established a temporary command center in the barn, with permission hastily granted by Thomas once he'd verified their credentials. By mid-morning, the impromptu summit had expanded to include key members of the president's agricultural policy team, who arrived via the now cleared roads. Sarah had transitioned seamlessly from shocked hostess to engaged participant, her intimate knowledge of Oakridge Valley's agricultural challenges providing invaluable context for the policy discussions. Thomas, initially the more skeptical of the pair, found himself grudgingly impressed by the detailed understanding of agricultural economics displayed by the presidential advisors. When the conversation turned to specific challenges facing Willow Creek Farm, from water rights to equipment modernization costs, the proposed solutions revealed careful research rather than political platitudes. "The fundamental issue here," Thomas observed during a discussion of regional water management, "is that corporations like Had Corp can afford to play the long game. They acquire water rights knowing that eventually farms like ours will have no choice but to sell." President Harrington nodded thoughtfully, "which is why the Preservation Initiative includes provisions for community-based water management districts with enhanced protection against external acquisition." "But that's years away from implementation," Sarah pointed out. Meanwhile, Had Corp continues purchasing options on water rights throughout the valley. James exchanged a glance with the president, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Actually, Mrs. Miller, there's another aspect of our visit that we haven't yet discussed." He retrieved a final document from his briefcase. "This is a draft executive order specifically addressing predatory water rights acquisition in agricultural preservation zones. It would establish an immediate moratorium on corporate purchases pending review by the Department of Agriculture. And it's ready for signature," President Harrington added, "pending final adjustments based on our discussions here today." The implication hung in the air. Concrete action, not just promises, emerging from this unexpected visit. The conversation shifted to practical next steps, with the president's staff arranging for a community meeting at the Oakridge Valley Community Center later that day, weather permitting. As the morning progressed, the initial shock of finding the President of the United States in their kitchen gave way to pragmatic engagement with the issues at hand. Sarah found herself impressed despite her ingrained skepticism of political promises. The questions being asked revealed genuine interest in preserving not just the physical farms, but the knowledge systems and community connections they represented. Around noon, with the policy discussions well underway, Sarah slipped away to prepare lunch for what had become an impromptu summit meeting. In the relative privacy of the pantry, gathering ingredients for sandwiches to feed the unexpected delegation, she allowed herself a moment to process the extraordinary turn of events. 24 hours earlier, her greatest concern had been ensuring the livestock survived the blizzard. Now, she was hosting the president while discussing policy initiatives that could transform not just Willow Creek Farm, but agricultural communities nationwide. All because she had chosen to help a stranger collapsed in the snow rather than turn him away. The thought prompted a wry smile as she assembled sandwiches with homemade bread and preserves. Life on a farm had taught her to expect the unexpected, though perhaps not quite this level of unexpected. Thomas found her there, momentarily separated from their distinguished guests. "You okay?" he asked quietly, the concern in his eyes reflecting the depth of understanding that came with decades of partnership. "I'm fine," she assured him, handing him a stack of plates. "Just trying to wrap my head around the fact that the President of the United States is sitting at our kitchen table discussing water rights and crop rotation." A rare grin broke through Thomas's usually serious demeanor, and all because you have a habit of taking in strays during blizzards. "Speaking of our unexpected guest," Sarah lowered her voice further, "do you believe his story about being sent ahead to evaluate us without warning?" Thomas considered this, his natural farmer's caution warring with the evidence before them. "It's unorthodox, but then again, so is a presidential visit to a farm in Hawthorne County during the worst blizzard in decades." He paused, adding, "And it explains Jake Thompson's reaction when I mentioned Bennett's name on the radio. Local law enforcement would have been notified of a White House advance team in the area." Sarah nodded, accepting this logic, while a part of her remained alert to inconsistencies or hidden agendas. Years of negotiating with buyers, suppliers, and bank officers had honed her ability to detect the subtle tells that suggested someone wasn't being entirely forthcoming. "Well," she said finally, arranging the sandwiches on a serving platter, "whatever their real agenda, they're about to experience authentic Willow Creek Farm hospitality. Let's hope homemade bread and apple butter meet presidential standards." Thomas leaned in, pressing a quick kiss to her temple, a rare public display of affection even in the privacy of their pantry. "You've never failed to rise to a challenge. Yet, Sarah Miller, I doubt you'll start now with the leader of the free world at our table." Together they returned to the kitchen, where the president and her team were reviewing maps of Oakridge Valley spread across the sturdy oak table that had hosted Miller family meals for generations. The contrast between the high-tech tablets and security equipment now occupying the farmhouse kitchen and the heritage cooking implements hanging from century-old hooks created a visual metaphor for the very initiative being discussed: bridging traditional agricultural knowledge with modern policy approaches. President Harrington looked up as they entered, her experienced political eye not missing the renewed resolve in the farmer's postures. "Mrs. Miller, I hope we haven't completely disrupted your day with our unexpected arrival." Sarah sat down, the platter of sandwiches with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the value of what they offered. "Madam President, farming teaches you to adapt to whatever each day brings, though I admit a presidential visit exceeds our usual range of surprises." The president smiled, the expression reaching her eyes in a way that rarely happened during official Washington functions. One of the reasons I wanted to visit farms like yours personally is to experience that adaptability firsthand. The capacity to face unexpected challenges while maintaining core principles is exactly what we're trying to preserve through this initiative. As the group broke for lunch, the conversation shifted from formal policy discussion to more personal exchanges. President Harrington inquired about Rachel's agricultural studies, revealing a genuine interest in the next generation's perspective on farming. James shared stories from his own rural childhood in Iowa, establishing common ground that gradually eroded the remaining barriers of skepticism. By early afternoon, as the winter sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered fields of Willow Creek Farm, the outline of a partnership had emerged, not just between the Millers and the presidential initiative, but between the pragmatic wisdom of multi-generational farmers and the policy mechanisms designed to protect their legacy. Outside, the presidential security detail had established a discreet perimeter around the property, their black SUVs now familiar presences along the farm's boundaries. The helicopter that had initially landed in the east field stood ready for departure, its rotors occasionally tested by the flight crew in preparation for the president's eventual departure. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, President Harrington signed the executive order establishing the moratorium on predatory water rights acquisitions, using the same oak table where 4 generations of millers had planned their seasonal plantings. The historic significance of the moment was not lost on anyone present, least of all Sarah, who watched with quiet pride as her home became the birthplace of a policy that could preserve family farming traditions nationwide. "This is just the beginning," President Harrington said as she completed the signature. "The full Rural American Preservation Initiative will require congressional action and continued advocacy from farming communities themselves. But this executive order establishes immediate protections while the broader framework is developed." Thomas, who had witnessed decades of broken political promises, maintained his cautious pragmatism. "It's a start," he acknowledged, "but had Corp and companies like them have deep pockets and patient investors, they can wait out administrative changes. Which is precisely why we're establishing this initiative now, with bipartisan support," James explained. "By demonstrating concrete economic and national security benefits, we're creating incentives for future administrations to maintain these protections regardless of political affiliation." Sarah's practical mind had already moved to next steps. The community meeting at the Valley Center. "Will you be explaining these measures to our neighbors who haven't yet sold to Had Corp?" "That's the plan," President Harrington confirmed. "Though I suspect seeing is believing in communities like yours. Which is why we want you and Thomas to help present the initiative, not as government representatives, but as farmers who understand what's truly at stake." The request hung in the air between them, representing both an opportunity and a risk. By publicly associating themselves with the presidential initiative, the Millers would be taking a stand that would inevitably generate both support and opposition within their community. After decades of carefully navigating the complex social dynamics of rural life, they were being asked to step into a spotlight neither had sought. Thomas and Sarah exchanged a long look, the kind of wordless communication that develops between couples who have weathered countless challenges together. In that glance was a shared recognition of the risks, balanced against the potential benefits not just for Willow Creek Farm, but for the agricultural heritage they hope to pass on to Rachel and future generations. "We'll do it," Thomas said. Finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a decision thoroughly considered. "Not because we trust government programs. History gives us plenty of reason for skepticism, but because someone needs to stand up before there's nothing left to protect." President Harrington nodded, recognizing the significance of the commitment. Your credibility with your neighbors is precisely why your participation matters. This initiative can't succeed as something imposed from Washington. It needs to be embraced by the farming communities it's designed to protect. As preparations began for the community meeting, Sarah found herself momentarily alone with James Bennett, the mysterious stranger whose arrival during the blizzard had catalyzed this extraordinary chain of events. He stood by the window, watching. The Secret Service coordinates security arrangements for the president's movement to the community center. "You never really got lost in the storm, did you?" Sarah asked quietly, joining him at the window. James turned, his expression sheepish but unapologetic. "The car accident was real enough. These roads are treacherous even for someone expecting winter conditions. But finding your specific farm wasn't entirely accidental. Why the deception? Why not simply request a meeting?" He considered the question with evident respect for her directness. "Because politicians and officials have been requesting meetings with farmers for decades, making promises that rarely translate into meaningful action. We needed to understand what Willow Creek Farm truly represents, not the version prepared for official visits." Sarah studied him, weighing his explanation against her instinctive assessment of character developed through years of community engagement. "And does the president always conduct agricultural policy research through staged emergencies?" A genuine smile broke through James's professional demeanor. President Harrington has been known for unconventional approaches throughout her career, but no, this particular method was improvised when the opportunity presented itself. Before Sarah could press further, Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression a mixture of amazement and concern. "You might want to see this," he said, gesturing for them to follow him to the front porch. Sarah and James stepped outside into the crisp winter air, where the afternoon sun had begun melting patches of snow, creating a glistening landscape. Across Willow Creek Farm, what immediately caught Sarah's attention wasn't the natural beauty, however, but the line of vehicles turning into their long driveway, not government SUVs this time, but farm trucks, old sedans, and even a few tractors, slowly making their way through the partially plowed lane. "Words spread," Thomas said unnecessarily, watching as the impromptu parade approached. "Looks like half of Oakridge Valley is headed our way." President Harrington joined them on the porch, flanked by Secret Service agents whose calm professionalism couldn't quite mask their concern at the unexpected civilian approach. "I see news travels quickly in rural communities," she observed, her tone revealing neither alarm nor surprise. "Fastest communication system ever invented," Sarah replied. Dryly, small-town word-of-mouth beats any fiber-optic network. The lead vehicle, a mud-splattered pickup truck that had clearly forced its way through snowdrifts, pulled up near the farmhouse. Henry Collins, their closest neighbor and a third-generation dairy farmer, stepped out, his weathered face a mask of disbelief as he took in the presidential security detail, now positioned strategically around the property. "Thomas, Sarah," he called out, approaching cautiously. "Jake Thompson's boy called over the emergency radio system, saying the President of the United States was at your place." He stopped abruptly, finally registering the silver-haired woman, standing between the millers. "Good Lord, it's really her." More vehicles arrived, disgorging farmers and townspeople bundled against the cold, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright skepticism. Emma Parker from the general store, the Garcia family who had reportedly sold their farm to Hadcorp just weeks earlier. Mayor Wilson, hastily dressed in what appeared to be his Sunday suit beneath an incongruous work coat. Even Dr. Levinson from the veterinary clinic, who must have abandoned his morning appointments to witness this unprecedented event. Within 15 minutes, the farmyard had transformed into an impromptu town gathering with more than 30 residents of Oakridge Valley standing in awkward clusters, stealing glances at the president while pretending not to stare directly. "So much for the planned community meeting," James murmured to Sarah, watching the crowd grow. "This is the community meeting," she replied. "Just moved up a few hours and relocated to our front yard." President Harrington, demonstrating the political instincts that had carried her through 2 terms in office, stepped forward without hesitation. "Good afternoon," she called out, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent gathering. "I had planned to meet many of you later today at the community center, but it seems Oakridge Valley preferred not to wait. I appreciate your enthusiasm, though I apologize for disrupting your regular routines after such a significant storm." Thomas moved to stand beside the president, his presence a bridge between Washington authority and local credibility. For those who haven't heard the full story, the president is here to discuss a new initiative aimed at protecting family farms like ours from corporate takeovers. She's already signed an executive order this morning that puts immediate restrictions on water rights acquisitions by companies like Hadcorp. A murmur ran through the crowd, surprise, skepticism, and cautious hope mixing in equal measure. Henry Collins stepped forward, cap in hand, but chin raised with the quiet dignity of a man who had worked the land for 5 decades. "With all due respect, Madam President," he began, his voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. "We've heard plenty of promises from Washington over the years. Meanwhile, farms that have been in families for generations keep disappearing into corporate portfolios." Several heads nodded in agreement, the collective wariness of a rural community that had learned through bitter experience that political attention rarely translated to meaningful assistance. President Harrington met the challenge directly. "Mr. Collins, you have every reason to be skeptical. Agricultural policy in this country has too often favored scale over sustainability, extraction over stewardship. What brings me to Willow Creek Farm today isn't another set of empty promises, but the beginning of a concrete shift in how we value and protect America's agricultural heritage." She gestured toward James, who distributed copies of the executive order and policy framework to those nearest. The documents being shared outline immediate protections against predatory acquisition tactics, followed by a comprehensive initiative that will preserve family farming operations as a matter of national security. Mayor Wilson, who had managed to position himself near the front of the gathering, skimmed the document with the practiced eye of a local official accustomed to regulatory language. "This executive order has real teeth," he acknowledged, looking up with surprise. The moratorium on water rights transfers alone would halt Hadcorp's current strategy. "That's the intention," President Harrington confirmed. "But the executive order is just the first step. The broader initiative requires congressional action and, most importantly, engagement from communities like yours." Emma Parker, whose general store had survived the economic pressures of larger retailers through a combination of community loyalty and strategic adaptation, raised her hand hesitantly. "What about those who've already sold to Hadcorp? The Petersons, the Garcias, is it too late for them?" The question hung in the frigid air, representing the unspoken fear that preservation efforts might have come too late for many family operations. Sarah noted the Garcia family shifting uncomfortably at the back of the gathering, their recent decision to sell now cast in a new light by these unexpected developments. The initiative includes provisions for reacquisition of recently sold farmland under favorable terms, James explained, directing his response to the Garcias rather than speaking about them in the third person. Not forcing Hadcorp to sell, but creating economic and regulatory incentives that make it advantageous for them to return land to family ownership. Miguel Garcia, patriarch of the family that had farmed in the valley since the 1970s, stepped forward with the cautious hope of someone who had nearly abandoned a lifelong dream. Our contract has a 30-day reconsideration clause that expires next week. Are you saying there might be a path to keep our land after all? I'm saying we want to create that path, President Harrington replied. Not just for your family, Mr. Garcia, but for agricultural communities nationwide. The conversation expanded, with farmers asking increasingly specific questions about how the initiative would address the practical challenges they faced, from equipment modernization costs to market access limitations that made it difficult to compete with corporate-scale operations. What began as skeptical inquiry gradually transformed into engaged problem-solving, with the president and her team taking notes on issues unique to Oakridge Valley that hadn't been fully captured in their research. Sarah, watching this spontaneous exchange unfold in her farmyard, felt a tentative optimism take root alongside her ingrained caution. The questions being asked weren't met with political deflections, but with substantive responses or honest acknowledgements of areas still being developed. The informal gathering continued for nearly 2 hours, with participants eventually breaking into smaller discussion groups focused on specific aspects of the proposed initiative. The president moved among these clusters, listening more than speaking, occasionally conferring with her staff to address particularly technical questions about implementation details. As the winter sun began its early descent, casting long shadows across the snow-covered fields, Mayor Wilson stepped up onto the porch to address the assembled community. "Folks," he called out, bringing the various conversations to a gradual halt, "I think we've imposed on the Millers' hospitality long enough for one day. The community center is cleared and heated. I propose we continue this discussion there, where we can set up properly and allow everyone to participate more comfortably." The suggestion was met with nods of agreement. The impromptu gathering began to disperse, with farmers and townspeople returning to their vehicles, many lingering to shake the president's hand or share a final thought about the initiative. Through it all, Sarah noted the quiet dignity with which their community conducted itself. No grandstanding, no manufactured enthusiasm, just the measured engagement of people whose livelihoods depended on sound agricultural policy. As the procession of vehicles departed down the long driveway, Thomas turned to President Harrington. "I hope that gave you a genuine sense of what you're dealing with. These people won't be won over with promises, but they'll work themselves to the bone for programs that actually address their needs." The president nodded, a new respect evident in her expression. "What I witnessed today was precisely what this initiative needs: practical knowledge combined with generational commitment to the land. Washington can provide policy frameworks and funding, but the solutions have to be grounded in the experience of communities like yours." "You should probably get to the community center," Sarah suggested, noting the continued departure of vehicles. "They'll be waiting for you, and a presidential delay might undermine the goodwill you've established." President Harrington checked her watch, then conferred briefly with her chief of staff, who had emerged from inside the farmhouse. "You're right, Mrs. Miller, though I hope you and Thomas will join us there. Your credibility with your neighbors is an essential bridge between this initiative and the community it's designed to serve." Thomas glanced at Sarah, a silent question passing between them. She nodded almost imperceptibly. They had already crossed the threshold from observers to participants in this unexpected political moment. "We'll be there," Thomas confirmed, "though we'll follow in our own vehicle. We've had enough government. Escorts for one day." The president laughed. a genuine, unguarded sound rarely captured by news cameras. Fair enough, Mr. Miller. I look forward to continuing our discussion with the broader community. As the presidential motorcade prepared for departure, Sarah pulled James aside. "One question before you go," she said quietly. "Why us? Why Willow Creek Farm specifically? There are other operations in the valley with similar histories." James considered the question with appropriate seriousness. "The satellite data analysis identified your farm as having exceptional outcomes across multiple sustainability metrics. The County Extension Office records showed consistent innovation in agricultural practices. But ultimately, it was your daughter, Rachel's research paper on adaptive farming techniques, that brought Willow Creek Farm to our attention." "Rachel's paper?" Sarah repeated, surprised. "From her undergraduate program?" "Her analysis of multi-generational knowledge transfer in family farming operations became required reading in certain policy circles last year," James explained. "She cited Willow Creek Farm's practices extensively, though she never explicitly identified it as her family's operation. When our team cross-referenced her examples with agricultural data, the patterns led us here." Sarah absorbed this information with a mixture of maternal pride and amazement. Their daughter's academic work had created a pathway to their door that ultimately led to a presidential visit and potentially transformative policy initiative. "Does Rachel know about any of this?" she asked, suddenly wondering how their daughter would react to learning about today's extraordinary events. "Not yet," James admitted, "though I suspect she'll be receiving a rather interesting phone call from her parents very soon." The presidential motorcade departed with the same efficiency with which it had arrived, leaving Willow Creek Farm in relative quiet once more. Sarah and Thomas stood on their porch, watching the procession of black SUVs navigate the snowy driveway toward the main road, the winter sunlight glinting off their government plates. "You know," Thomas said finally, breaking the contemplative silence, "when I checked the barn last night during the blizzard, I never imagined we'd be hosting the President of the United States for lunch today." Sarah smiled, slipping her arm through his in a rare public display of affection. "And I never imagined that helping a stranger collapsed in our mudroom would lead to an executive order being signed on our kitchen table." "Do you think anything will actually come of it?" Thomas asked, the farmer's perpetual caution reasserting itself now that the immediate excitement had passed. "Or is this just another political photo opportunity that fades once the motorcade leaves town?" Sarah considered the question seriously, reviewing the detailed discussions she'd witnessed throughout the day. "The executive order is real enough. Mayor Wilson confirmed that. As for the broader initiative..." She paused, weighing hope against experience. "I think there's genuine commitment behind it. Whether that survives the political process remains to be seen." Thomas nodded, accepting her assessment. "Well, we'd better get changed if we're going to make it to the community center. Can't show up to a presidential town hall in clothes that smell like the barn." They entered the farmhouse, now strangely quiet after hours of unprecedented activity. Secret Service agents had thoroughly swept the premises before the president's departure, leaving everything meticulously in place, but somehow altered by their professional scrutiny. In the kitchen, the executive order signing photo session had been documented by the White House photographer who had promised to send official images for the Miller's records. Sarah moved through the familiar rooms, trying to reconcile the extraordinary events of the day with the unchanged physical reality of their home. The same worn floorboards creaked beneath her feet. The family photographs still lined the hallway. The quilt her grandmother had made still draped across the back of the living room sofa. Yet something fundamental had shifted, not just in the potential trajectory of Willow Creek Farm, but in their understanding of their place within the broader agricultural landscape. As they prepared to join the community meeting, Sarah paused to call Rachel at her university dormitory. The conversation was predictably incredulous, with their daughter initially convinced her parents were pulling an elaborate prank. Only when Sarah described specific policy details that couldn't have been invented did Rachel finally accept the extraordinary truth that her academic work had indirectly led to a presidential visit to her family farm. "Mom, this is insane," Rachel said, her voice carrying both excitement and disbelief. "The president was actually in our kitchen because of my paper?" "According to Deputy Director Bennett, your research helped identify Willow Creek Farm as a potential model for the preservation initiative," Sarah confirmed, still processing the connection herself. "Though I suspect we would have come to their attention eventually given the metrics they were tracking." "I'm coming home," Rachel declared immediately. "The roads must be clearing by now, and I need to see this for myself." "The community meeting will probably be over by the time you could get here," Sarah cautioned. "And your father and I need to leave in a few minutes. Not just for the meeting, Mum, for the weekend, maybe longer. If Willow Creek Farm is going to be part of shaping national agricultural policy, I want to be involved. This is exactly what my program has been preparing me for." Sarah smiled at the passion in her daughter's voice, the same determination that had characterized 4 generations of millers working this land. "We'll see you when you get here safely," she said simply. "Drive carefully. The main roads should be plowed, but the county routes might still be dicey." After completing the call, Sarah joined Thomas in the mudroom, where he was pulling on his best winter boots, still practical farming footwear, but without the accompanying scent of the barn that permeated his everyday pair. "Rachel's driving home," she informed him, reaching for her coat. "Says she wants to be part of whatever happens next with this initiative." Thomas nodded, unsurprised by their daughter's response. "Always said that girl has more Miller in her than either of us. Stubborn determination, wrapped in academic vocabulary." They made their final preparations in companionable silence, each processing the day's events in their own way. As they stepped out into the late afternoon chill, the familiar landscape of Willow Creek Farm spread before them, fields now blanketed in snow that would, come spring, nurture the crops they'd soon plant. The barn, where generations of livestock had sheltered through countless winters. The equipment shed housing the tractor Thomas's grandfather had purchased new in 1962, still functioning thanks to meticulous maintenance and ingenious adaptations. All of it, the land, the buildings, the equipment, and most importantly, the accumulated knowledge of how to make it all work together sustainably, was what the Preservation Initiative sought to protect. Not as a museum piece or historical curiosity, but as a living, evolving agricultural system that balanced production with stewardship. The drive to the Oakridge Valley Community Center took them past neighboring farms, some still operated by the same families who had worked them for generations, others now bearing the standardized signage of Hadcorp's corporate holdings. The contrast was stark. The individual character of family operations versus the uniform appearance of corporate agriculture. "This road used to be nothing but family farms when I was a kid," Thomas observed as they passed the old Peterson place, recently acquired by Haydee Corp and already undergoing renovations to accommodate larger equipment. 23 distinct operations between our place and town, now more than half are corporate holdings. Sarah nodded, noting the changes that had accumulated so gradually they sometimes failed to register the full extent of the transformation until they consciously looked for it. "Makes you wonder what Rachel will see when she drives this road 30 years from now." "That's really what today is about, isn't it?" Thomas replied, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Not just preserving what's left, but ensuring there's something worth inheriting for the next generation." The Oakridge Valley Community Center came into view as they crested the final hill before town, a sturdy brick building constructed during the New Deal era that had served as the heart of local governance and social activities for nearly 90 years. The parking lot and adjacent field were filled with vehicles ranging from government SUVs to farm trucks, indicating that the gathering had indeed expanded well beyond the initial group that had appeared at their farm. As they parked and approached the entrance, Sarah noted the subtle but unmistakable security presence. Secret Service agents positioned at key points, communications equipment discreetly visible beneath winter coats. The presidential visit had transformed this familiar community space into a temporary extension of federal authority. Yet the atmosphere inside remained distinctly local. The main hall was filled nearly to capacity, with residents seated in the folding chairs that had served community functions from holiday concerts to agricultural cooperative meetings for decades. President Harrington stood at the front, engaged in what appeared to be an extensive question and answer session, with James and other staff members providing supporting details when technical questions arose. The critical distinction, the President was explaining as Thomas and Sarah slipped into seats near the back, is that this initiative doesn't impose a single model on all agricultural communities. It establishes protective frameworks within which local farming traditions can evolve according to their own needs and conditions. Henry Collins, never one to accept political statements at face value, raised his hand. That sounds fine in theory, Madam President, but federal programs have a way of turning into one-size-fits-all regulations once they filter down through the bureaucracy. How do we ensure local control remains genuinely local? It was a question that cut to the heart of rural America's perpetual tension with federal governance, the balance between needed support and feared interference. Sarah watched with interest as President Harrington addressed the challenge directly rather than deflecting it. That's precisely why the initiative's governance model establishes regional agricultural councils with majority representation from active farming operations, she explained. Federal agencies provide resources and coordination, but implementation decisions remain primarily local. It's an approach we've piloted successfully in watershed management programs across 7 states. The discussion continued in this vein, with community members raising practical concerns and the presidential team offering specific responses or acknowledging areas where further development was needed. What struck Sarah most was the absence of partisan framing. The conversation focused almost exclusively on agricultural outcomes rather than political positioning. Mayor Wilson eventually called for a short break, allowing participants to stretch and engage in the smaller conversations that often revealed their true thoughts more clearly than formal questions. Sarah and Thomas found themselves approached by neighbors and friends, all eager to hear their assessment of the day's extraordinary events. "Is this for real, Sarah?" Emma Parker asked quietly, the shopkeeper's pragmatic nature evident in her direct question. "Or are we being set up for another round of broken promises?" "The executive order is real," Sarah replied, keeping her voice equally low. "I watched it being signed on our kitchen table. As for the broader initiative," she hesitated, weighing her words carefully. "I believe the intention is genuine. Whether it survives the political process intact is another question entirely." Emma nodded, accepting the measured response. "The Garcias are talking about invoking their reconsideration clause with HAD Corp based on today's announcements. Miguel asked if you thought they should risk it." Sarah glanced across the room to where the Garcia family stood in conversation with James, their expressions animated with renewed hope. "That's not a decision I can make for them," she replied carefully, "though I will say the specific provisions regarding recently sold properties seemed well developed in the materials we reviewed." Similar conversations unfolded throughout the hall, with community members processing the implications of the proposed initiative through the filter of their individual circumstances. Thomas found himself engaged with a group of livestock producers discussing the potential impact on regional processing facilities, while Mayor Wilson conferred with county commissioners about jurisdictional questions raised by the preservation zones concept. When the formal session resumed, President Harrington called Sarah and Thomas to join her at the front of the hall, a public acknowledgement of Willow Creek Farm's central role in bringing the initiative to Oakridge Valley. "I want to be transparent about how we came to focus on your community," the president explained to the assembled residents. "The Millers didn't seek this attention. Their farm's exceptional performance across multiple sustainability metrics, combined with research conducted by their daughter Rachel, brought Willow Creek Farm to our attention as we were identifying potential models for the preservation initiative." Thomas, never comfortable with public attention, nevertheless stepped forward when prompted. "Sarah and I are just as surprised by today's events as anyone in this room," he said, his straightforward manner reassuring to neighbors who might otherwise have suspected prior arrangements. "We don't pretend to know whether this initiative will deliver everything being promised, but after reviewing the details and asking our own hard questions, we believe it represents a genuine attempt to address the challenges facing family farms like ours." Sarah added her own perspective, her practical nature complementing Thomas's cautious endorsement. "What matters most isn't the promises made today, but the concrete protections implemented tomorrow and sustained in the years ahead. That's why community engagement with this process is so essential, not just in this initial phase, but throughout the development and implementation of the broader initiative." Their remarks seemed to resonate with the gathered community, providing a bridge between Washington policy proposals and local agricultural reality. As the formal meeting transitioned into working groups focused on specific aspects of the initiative, Sarah noted a subtle but significant shift in the community's engagement, from skeptical questioning to cautious problem-solving. The remainder of the evening unfolded in a productive blur of discussions, document reviews, and community feedback sessions. By the time President Harrington prepared to depart for her next commitment, the initial framework had been substantively improved by the practical insights of farmers who would be most directly affected by its implementation. "This is exactly the kind of engagement we hope to achieve," James told Sarah as the presidential team gathered their materials. "Not ceremonial consultation, but genuine co-development of policy approaches. Just remember that the perspectives shared today represent decades of hard-won agricultural knowledge," Sarah replied. "They deserve more than ceremonial acknowledgement in the final initiative." James nodded, his expression serious. "That's why we're establishing ongoing consultation mechanisms with communities like yours. This isn't a one-day listening exercise, it's the beginning of a sustained partnership." As the community meeting wound down, with presidential staff collecting contact information for follow-up discussions and community members forming informal working groups to continue engagement with the initiative, Sarah found herself standing apart for a moment, observing the transformed dynamics of her community. Where the day had begun with individual farmers facing corporate pressure in isolation, it was ending with collaborative problem-solving and renewed commitment to preserving their agricultural heritage. Thomas joined her, his expression thoughtful, as he surveyed the scene. "Quite a day," he observed simply, the understatement characteristic of a man who processed momentous events internally rather than through extensive verbalization. "Quite a day," Sarah agreed, leaning slightly against his solid presence. "Though I keep wondering what happens tomorrow when the motorcade is gone and we're left to determine whether any of this translates into actual protection for farms like ours." "That's when the real work begins," came a new voice from behind them. They turned to find President Harrington approaching, having momentarily stepped away from her security detail. Today established the foundation. The structures we build on it will determine whether this initiative succeeds or fails. And if the political winds shift, Thomas asked bluntly, your administration has less than a year remaining. What happens to these protections under different leadership? It was the question that hung unspoken over much of the day's discussions, the vulnerability of executive actions to political transitions. President Harrington didn't offer false reassurances. That's precisely why the initiative is designed as a bipartisan framework with benefits that transcend political affiliation, she explained. Agricultural security and rural community preservation resonate across political divides when properly framed. And frankly, Mr. Miller, that's where families like yours become essential, not as political advocates, but as living proof that preserving family farming operations serves national interests, regardless of partisan considerations. Sarah considered this perspective, appreciating the candor while maintaining her natural caution. So, Willow Creek Farm becomes a test case, both for the initiative's protections and for its political sustainability. More an exemplar than a test case, the president clarified. Your farm demonstrates what's possible when traditional agricultural knowledge combines with adaptive innovation. That's a compelling narrative, regardless of political perspective. Before they could explore this concept further, a Secret Service agent approached to inform the president that her transportation was ready for departure. Final handshakes were exchanged, contact information confirmed, and promises made for ongoing engagement as the initiative developed. As the presidential motorcade departed from Oakridge Valley Community Center, leaving behind a community energized by possibility, yet seasoned with rural pragmatism, Sarah and Thomas found themselves surrounded by neighbors eager to continue processing the extraordinary events of the day. So, Henry Collins said, capturing the collective sentiment in his characteristically direct manner, a stranger shows up during the worst blizzard in decades, and by morning, we've got the President of the United States signing executive orders on your kitchen table. Just another day at Willow Creek Farm, eh, Sarah? The gathering erupted in laughter, the tension-releasing mirth of a community that had experienced something beyond their ordinary expectations, but was already incorporating it into their shared narrative. Just practicing standard farm country hospitality, Sarah replied, with a smile that acknowledged the absurdity while honoring the significance of what they'd witnessed. Though I will admit, the President of the United States wasn't exactly who I expected to be serving lunch to when I baked that bread yesterday morning. As the community gradually dispersed, with promises to reconvene once they'd had time to thoroughly review the initiative materials, Sarah and Thomas began the drive back to Willow Creek Farm. The winter evening had fully descended, transforming the snow-covered landscape into a monochromatic study of shadows and moonlight. Rachel should be arriving in a few hours, Sarah noted, watching the familiar contours of their valley pass by. Assuming the university roads are as clear as she thinks. Thomas nodded, his thoughts clearly still processing the implications of the day's events. She'll be disappointed to have missed the president, but I suspect she'll be even more interested in the initiative details. This is exactly the kind of policy work she's been studying. James said her research paper helped bring Willow Creek Farm to their attention, Sarah shared, still marveling at the connection. All those hours she spent documenting your grandfather's crop rotation innovations and my mother's seed preservation techniques. Turns out she wasn't just satisfying academic requirements. A rare smile crossed Thomas's face, paternal pride, momentarily eclipsing his usual reserve. Maybe the fifth generation of Millers will contribute to Willow Creek Farm in ways we never anticipated. As they turned onto the long driveway leading to their farmhouse, the familiar silhouette of buildings that had sheltered 4 generations came into view, now transformed by the day's events from merely their home into a symbolic representation of America's agricultural heritage. The weight of that responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders, not an unwelcome burden, but a significance beyond what she had imagined when she chose to help a stranger collapsed in their mudroom during a blizzard. "Whatever happens with this initiative," she said quietly as they approached the farmhouse, now returned to its pre-dawn stillness, "we did the right thing last night. Politics aside, a person needed help, and we provided it. That's the principle that matters most." Thomas reached across the seat to squeeze her hand briefly, a gesture that conveyed more in its simplicity than lengthy declarations ever could. "As you said to the president, Sarah, some values transcend politics, helping neighbors in need, stewarding the land for future generations, standing firm against those who would exploit rather than nurture. Those aren't partisan positions. They're the foundations of rural communities like ours." They parked near the barn and made their way toward the house, their boots crunching through snow illuminated by moonlight reflecting off its crystalline surface. The events of the day, extraordinary by any measure, began to settle into perspective against the backdrop of their ongoing commitment to this land and the agricultural traditions it represented. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, continued engagement with the Preservation Initiative, practical farming decisions as spring approached, and the integration of Rachel's academic insights into their evolving operations. But tonight, as they returned to the farmhouse where a stranger's arrival had catalyzed such unexpected developments, Sarah and Thomas Miller carried a renewed appreciation for how individual choices could ripple outward to affect not just their farm, but potentially agricultural communities nationwide. Sarah paused on the porch, looking back over the moonlit expanse of Willow Creek Farm, the fields, buildings, and natural features that had shaped her life and the lives of generations before her. In the distance, a fox moved silently across the snow-covered pasture, its red coat visible against the white landscape, a reminder that beyond political initiatives and policy frameworks, the land itself continued its ancient cycles, indifferent to human declarations, yet profoundly affected by human choices. "Come inside," Thomas said gently, recognizing her moment of reflection. "It's been quite a day, and tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Sarah nodded, turning toward the warm light spilling from their farmhouse windows. Whatever the Preservation Initiative ultimately delivered or failed to deliver, Willow Creek Farm would continue, adapting, evolving, but remaining true to the essential values that had sustained it through 4 generations of Millers. 1 year later, the apple trees in the eastern orchard of Willow Creek Farm bloomed with extraordinary vigor that spring morning, their delicate white petals contrasting against the clear blue sky. Sarah Miller moved between the rows, clipboard in hand, noting which varieties were thriving under the new pollinator-friendly management system they'd implemented last fall. The sweet scent of blossoms mingled with the earthy aroma of recently tilled soil from the adjacent fields where Thomas was preparing for the season's planting. A gentle breeze carried the distant sound of construction equipment from the old Peterson place half a mile down the road. The Petersons themselves, Mark and his father Edward, had returned to farming operations 6 months ago, exercising the reacquisition provisions established under the Rural American Preservation Initiative to reclaim their family land from AdCorp. The construction noise came from renovations to their processing facility, now being expanded as part of the regional agricultural cooperative that had emerged in the wake of President Harrington's historic visit. Sarah paused beneath a particularly vigorous tree, examining the abundant blossoms while reflecting on the extraordinary changes that had unfolded since that fateful blizzard night when James Bennett had collapsed at their doorstep. The initial skepticism of the Oakridge Valley community had gradually given way to cautious engagement as the promised protections materialized into concrete programs. The executive order signed on their kitchen table had indeed halted Hadcorp's acquisition of water rights, creating breathing room for family operations to establish more sustainable positions. The sound of tires on gravel drew Sarah's attention to the driveway, where a familiar electric vehicle was approaching. Rachel Miller, now splitting her time between graduate studies in agricultural policy and practical implementation at Willow Creek Farm, had returned from her meeting in Riverdale. At 20, she carried herself with the confident poise of someone who had found her purpose at the intersection of academic theory and practical farming. "Mom!" Rachel called out, striding through the orchard with a tablet in hand. "Just got out of the regional council meeting. The watershed protection funding came through, full allocation for Oakridge Valley." Sarah smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm. Rachel had thrown herself into the implementation of the preservation initiative with characteristic determination, serving as the bridge between her parents' generation of practical farmers and the policy mechanisms designed to protect their way of life. "That's wonderful news," Sarah replied, tucking her clipboard under her arm. "Your father will be pleased. He's been worried about reinforcing the western creek banks before the summer storms arrive." They walked together through the orchard, Rachel rapidly scrolling through details on her tablet. "The council approved all 11 infrastructure projects we submitted. And here's the best part. They're implementing the modified version of DAD's water management system across 3 counties." Pride warmed Sarah's chest. Thomas's innovative approach to watershed management, developed through decades of practical experience and refined through Rachel's academic research, was now being recognized as a model for regional implementation. It validated everything the Preservation Initiative had promised, valuing generational farming knowledge rather than replacing it with corporate standardization. As they approached the farmhouse, Sarah noticed a familiar government vehicle parked beside the barn. "Looks like James is here," she observed, scanning for their unexpected visitor. "Deputy Director Bennett is inspecting the pilot project with Dad," Rachel confirmed, her tone shifting to the more formal register she adopted. When discussing official business, they're evaluating the integrated pest management results from the demonstration field. Sarah nodded, still occasionally struck by the strange duality of their situation, continuing the daily work of running a family farm while simultaneously serving as a model for national agricultural policy. In the year since President Harrington's Visit Willow Creek Farm had hosted delegations from agricultural communities across the country, all eager to understand how the preservation initiative might be adapted to their specific needs and conditions. James Bennett had become a regular visitor, his initial deception during the blizzard long forgiven as his genuine commitment to the initiative became evident through consistent action rather than political promises. He had proven a valuable ally as the broader program moved through congressional approval, helping translate the Millers' practical insights into policy language without losing their essential meaning. They found Thomas and James in the demonstration field, deep in conversation as they examined plants for signs of beneficial insect activity. Thomas had initially been skeptical about participating in the USDA research program, wary of government interference in his farming practices, but the approach had been collaborative rather than prescriptive, integrating his generational knowledge with scientific methodologies in ways that respected both. "Sarah," James greeted them with a warm smile, no longer the polished bureaucrat who had arrived during a blizzard, but a trusted partner in their shared mission. "Rachel was just telling me about the watershed funding approval. Congratulations. Your community's proposal was exemplary." Thomas straightened, brushing soil from his hands. At 46, he still carried himself with the quiet strength of a working farmer, though the past year had added new dimensions to his identity: respected community leader, policy advisor, and increasingly mentor to younger farmers implementing sustainable practices. The proposal succeeded because it was developed by the people who actually work this land, he replied, his initial wariness of government programs now tempered by positive experience. When farmers have meaningful input into policies affecting their operations, the outcomes tend to be more practical. That's becoming the benchmark for all our regional implementations, James acknowledged. The collaborative model developed here in Oakridge Valley is being replicated in agricultural communities across 7 states now. Sarah surveyed the demonstration field with quiet satisfaction. Beyond the immediate improvements to Willow Creek Farm, the preservation initiative had revitalized the broader community in ways few had anticipated. The Garcia family had successfully reclaimed their property from Hadcorp. The town's agricultural cooperative had established direct marketing channels that improved profits for family operations, and 3 young farming families had moved into the valley, attracted by the new supports for sustainable agriculture. We should head back to the house, she suggested, noting the approaching lunchtime. Emma Parker is bringing the final designs for the Heritage Seed Bank, and Mayor Wilson wants to discuss the summer internship program. The expanded kitchen table at Willow Creek Farm had become an unofficial community planning center over the past year. The original oak table where the president had signed the executive order remained in place, but it had been supplemented by an extension crafted from timber harvested from their own woodlot, symbolizing the growth that had emerged from that historic moment. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Rachel fell into step beside James, discussing technical aspects of the watershed project that would eventually form part of her graduate thesis. Sarah and Thomas followed a few paces behind, their hands occasionally brushing in the subtle display of affection they had perfected over 25 years of partnership. "Did you ever imagine," Sarah asked quietly, "when you dragged me to that 4-H meeting where we first met, that we'd end up hosting presidential policy sessions in our kitchen?" Thomas's rare smile softened his weathered features. "I was more focused on working up the courage to ask you to the county fair," he admitted, "though I always knew you were destined for bigger things than just being a farmer's wife." "I am a farmer's wife," she corrected him gently, "and a farmer myself. The fact that those identities now include shaping national agricultural policy doesn't change the fundamental commitment." As they approached the farmhouse, Sarah noted other vehicles beginning to arrive for the planned community meeting. Henry Collins's truck, Dr. Levinson's practical sedan, the Garcia's family van. The preservation initiative had transformed not just individual farms, but the collective dynamics of Oakridge Valley, reinforcing community bonds that had been fraying under corporate pressure. Emma Parker was already setting out her materials on the kitchen table when they entered, her general store now supplemented by a thriving business coordinating direct sales of valley products to urban markets. "Sarah, perfect timing. I've finalized the Heritage Seed catalog design. We're ready to launch the online platform next month." The kitchen quickly filled with community members, each bringing updates on their components of the valley's revitalization efforts. Mayor Wilson reported on infrastructure improvements funded through the initiative. Henry Collins shared results from implementing Thomas's water conservation methods on his dairy operation. The Garcia family presented plans for expanding their organic berry production now that their land had been fully reclaimed from corporate ownership. James Bennett observed the dynamic exchanges with evident satisfaction, occasionally contributing federal perspectives but primarily listening as the community worked through practical implementation details. This was precisely what the Preservation Initiative had been designed to foster, not government-directed agricultural policy, but locally driven stewardship supported by appropriate resources and protections. After the formal discussions concluded and community members began departing with action items for the coming weeks, James lingered behind, accepting Sarah's offer of coffee on the front porch. The view from Willow Creek Farm had changed subtly over the past year, not in the physical landscape, which remained a patchwork of family operations nestled among the gentle hills of Oakridge Valley, but in the atmosphere of renewed vitality that permeated the community. I received an interesting call from President Harrington yesterday, James mentioned, watching a pair of bluebirds dart between the maple trees lining the driveway. She's preparing a series of legacy initiatives for her final months in office and wants to use Oakridge Valley as the location to announce an expansion of the preservation program. Sarah absorbed this information, considering its implications. Another presidential visit to our kitchen table. More likely the community center this time, James smiled, though she did specifically mention hoping to sample your apple butter. Again, the casual reference to the President of the United States enjoying her preserves no longer seemed as surreal as it once would have. The past year had normalized extraordinary connections while reinforcing the fundamental value of things Sarah had always prioritized: sustainable stewardship of the land, preservation of agricultural knowledge, and strengthening of community resilience. The timing would coincide with the first anniversary of the executive order, James continued, a natural milestone to highlight the initiative's concrete achievements and announce its expansion to additional agricultural regions. Sarah nodded, her practical mind already considering logistical implications. The Valley Showcase would be further along by then. The watershed projects will be visible, and the first harvest from the demonstration fields should be underway. From inside the house came the sound of Rachel's laughter, mingled with Thomas's deeper tones as they reviewed plans for the summer internship program that would bring agricultural students to work alongside experienced farmers throughout the valley. The initiative had created new pathways for intergenerational knowledge transfer, addressing one of the most critical challenges facing family farming operations nationwide. "When you collapsed in our mudroom during that blizzard," Sarah said, reflectively, pretending to be lost when you were actually scouting our farm, "did you genuinely believe the Preservation Initiative would deliver meaningful results? Or was it just another well-intentioned government program destined to fall short of its promises?" James considered the question with appropriate seriousness. "I believed in its potential," he answered carefully. "But potential means nothing without implementation, and implementation depends on people committed to making it work." He gestured toward the valley spread beneath them. "What's happened here exceeded even our most optimistic projections, not because of brilliant policy design, but because of how communities like yours engaged with the opportunity." The conversation was interrupted by Thomas calling from inside, needing Sarah's input on scheduling the communal equipment use for the coming planting season. The practical demands of farming continued regardless of policy discussions or presidential visits. Seeds needed planting, livestock required tending, and the land demanded consistent stewardship. As Sarah rose to answer her husband's call, she paused to survey Willow Creek Farm in the gentle spring light, the apple orchard where her grandfather had taught her to graft, the fields where 4 generations of millers had cultivated not just crops, but a way of life, the barn where Rachel had learned to birth lambs and repair machinery. All of it now protected not just for their family's future, but as part of a national commitment to preserving agricultural heritage. "You know," she said to James, when I helped you that night during the blizzard. I was just doing what any decent person would do, offering shelter to someone in need. I never imagined it would lead to all this." James nodded, understanding the deeper truth in her statement. The most significant changes often begin with the simplest acts of compassion. One person choosing kindness over suspicion, community over isolation, stewardship over exploitation. Sarah smiled at the philosophical turn in their conversation. Maybe that's the real lesson of the Preservation Initiative, that protecting family farms isn't just about agricultural policy or economic incentives. It's about recognizing that certain values are worth preserving because they bring out the best in who we are. She turned toward the house, where Thomas waited with practical questions requiring immediate attention, the eternal rhythm of farming life that continued beneath the broader policy discussions and national initiatives. Whatever significance, Willow Creek Farm had acquired as a model for agricultural preservation. It remained first and foremost their home, their livelihood, and their legacy. As Sarah rejoined her family in the kitchen, where an executive order had been signed and a national initiative born, she carried with her the quiet satisfaction of knowing that her simple act of compassion during a blizzard had catalyzed changes that would benefit not just Willow Creek Farm, but agricultural communities across the nation. The future remained uncertain, as it always did in farming. But the path forward now included protections and possibilities that had seemed unimaginable just 1 year earlier. Outside, the apple blossoms continued their brief but magnificent display against the spring sky, harbingers of the harvest to come and symbols of the cyclical renewal that had sustained Willow Creek Farm through 4 generations of millers, with a 5th now actively engaged in shaping its future. The Preservation Initiative might bear the government's formal stamp, but its true foundation lay in the values Sarah had always embraced: compassion for those in need, stewardship of the land, and faith in the resilience of rural communities, when given the tools and protections they needed to thrive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.